Right, now that it's 2 o'clock, we'll start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this Nordic Model Now webinar, which is titled Why Ash Regan's Unbuyable Bill is Right for Scotland, Unravelling the Myths Around the Nordic Model. We have a lineup of wonderful speakers, including the architect of the Unbuyable Bill, MSP Ash Regan, who are all going to speak to us for some minutes from their areas of expertise, following which we have time for a Q&A discussion. We've had some questions submitted already. You can type questions into the chat box at any time, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. Please keep your questions on topic, and please understand that we probably won't have time to answer all of them, but any questions we can't answer today, we can use to inform future events and perhaps come up at future Q&A sessions. I just want to give a short content warning as well before we begin. I'm sure you're all aware that today's webinar is going to discuss serious sexual violence in some detail, but we just want to remind you of that before we get started, because you may find some parts of the discussion upsetting. So please do bear that in mind if you continue watching. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Heli St Luce, who is a long-time member of Nordic Model Now. And Heli is going to give us a short introduction to the Nordic model and explain to us how it compares to full decriminalisation. Thank you, Heli.
Right. At the end, I will provide a link to references for all the studies mentioned. To understand an appropriate solution to a problem, we first need to understand what it involves. Many people assume prostitution is consensual sex that involves a negotiation with the woman and the punter equally placed in this negotiation. Drawing on the words of survivors, first Emily, who while at college swallowed the idea that sex work is a real job with easy money. I was sold a complete lie. It's not easy money. To the buyer, you are nothing more than an object for their consumption, not an actual human being with emotions. You're expected to just put up with whatever they want to say and do to you. The exchange of money makes them feel entitled to treat you however they like with no regard for your feelings. Esther echoes, the punter is king. It's a total myth that you can negotiate with him as an equal when you're in a private space operating in a competitive market and under the threat of bad online reviews, reprisals from the brothel manager, and/or violence from your pimp. It's nothing like the type of exchange you'd have with a sexual partner outside of the sex trade. Let's consider health and safety. Here are just some of the risks. Infections, including gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, herpes, hepatitis, HIV, and more. Unwanted pregnancy. Injuries, including tears, abrasions, and fissures to the vagina, anus, and rectum. Damage to internal organs caused by prolonged and heavy pounding, and other injuries caused by punter violence. Brain injury through strangulation and other acts of physical violence, mental health impacts, including very high rates of PTSD and other mental health disorders. Condoms don't give protection for these hazards, and many men refuse to wear them or stealth them off. In any other job that carries such risks, workers are required to wear full protective clothing. But how is that possible in prostitution? Why do we expect women to be exposed to risks that no other worker would tolerate, especially when it serves no purpose other than to feed men's egos and entitlement? When it's not possible to make work safe, industries have been closed down, like the asbestos industry. Prostitution can never be made safe. We call for the Nordic model, which aims to reduce the size of the industry while providing a viable transition out for those involved. Let's look at what buying sex does to men. And let's be clear, he's not paying for mutual sex between two adults who fancy each other. He pays because she doesn't want sex with him and he doesn't want to think about her feelings or needs. In other words, it's a one-sided sexual activity in which the man is in control. What does that do to a person? It increases his sense of entitlement and reduces his empathy. It makes him feel that it's his right to be in control and have his own way. And these are exactly the attitudes that underlie male violence against women and girls. Multiple studies show that men who pay for sex are more likely than other men to rape and engage in all forms of violence against women. This means that the more prostitution there is, the more male violence against women and girls that there's likely to be in the general community. Prostitution impacts everyone. So what is the Nordic model exactly? It's the only approach that recognizes prostitution as part of the structural oppression of women. It is both a cause and a consequence of the inequality between the sexes. The Nordic model was introduced in Sweden in 1999 after extensive research revealed A, the extent of women's suffering in prostitution, and B, sex buyers' ignorance and lack of care of the consequences of their actions. In brief, 1, the Nordic model decriminalizes selling sex because no one should be criminalized for enduring exploitation and abuse. 2, it invests in services that provide support and genuine routes out of the industry. Most research shows that around 90% want to get out at any given time but can't see how. 3, it makes buying sex a criminal offense with the key aim of changing attitudes and men's behavior. 4, it strengthens laws against trafficking, pimping, and brothel keeping. 5, there are also a plethora of holistic measures, including training for the police, public information campaigns, and measures to address poverty and inequality. Where the Nordic model is implemented well, it has been shown to reduce the size of the industry and create a hostile destination for international sex traffickers. In Sweden, it has brought about a change in the culture and men's behavior, and it has widespread public support. It's not surprising, therefore, that pimps and lobbyists for sexploitation hate the Nordic model. They insist it's more dangerous for the women involved, which is simply not true. What pimps and lobbyists want is full decriminalization, which makes all aspects of the sex trade legal. Pimps and brothel keepers are transformed into respectable business people, and buying sex is seen as like having a haircut. Prostitution is regarded as normal work, so there's no public funding for services to help women exit. Laws against trafficking are retained, but in practice they are rarely enforced. New Zealand pioneered full decriminalization in 2003. Lobbyists claim there has been a decrease in the numbers, that it's safer for the women, that women can refuse clients or particular services, that brothels have regular health inspections, and that condom use is compulsory. However, the data does not support any of these claims. The data actually shows that there was a rapid increase in the size of the industry. Violence and coercion remain rife. Women can seldom refuse clients or specific acts. Unprotected sex is common because men, quote, always or nearly always, end quote, ask for it. And there were 11 brothel inspections in 12 years, even though more than 1,000 brothel licenses were granted during that time. This slide compares the two approaches. Full decriminalization is on the left and the Nordic model is on the right. Germany and the Netherlands have legalized prostitution, which in theory is different from full decriminalization. However, there are many similarities. For example, both Germany and New Zealand have a massive industry with multi-story brothels. In Germany, around 1 million men pay for sex every single day. This chart shows the percentage of the population involved in prostitution in 6 countries. This shows a much smaller proportion of the population is involved in prostitution under the Nordic model. This suggests that the Nordic model is effective in reducing the size of the industry, or at least in preventing its growth. Lobbyists for full decriminalization say the Nordic model is more dangerous for the women involved. If this were true, we would expect to see higher rates of homicide of women involved in prostitution in countries that have the Nordic model and lower rates in countries that have legislation or decriminalization. This chart shows the homicide rate is significantly lower in Nordic model countries. This suggests that claims that the Nordic model is more dangerous for the women involved are false. However, we want to be clear. We are not claiming that the Nordic model is safer for women, because we do not believe that anything can make prostitution safe. Instead, the Nordic model aims to reduce the amount of prostitution that takes place. The data suggests that when well implemented, the Nordic model is successful in this. The fact is, prostitution is a very dangerous occupation. To illustrate this, I will end with a quote from an article by Valerie Hudson, an American academic. The homicide rate for prostitutes is 229 per 100,000, which is higher than the highest workplace homicide rates of any other occupation, including US soldiers' combat-related deaths. Yes, prostitutes are almost 10 times more likely to be killed than soldiers in combat. There is literally no category of work with a homicide rate as high as prostitution. This should tip us off that this is not work, but it is in fact a form of socially sanctioned violence against women. Thank you. This is the link to the references.
Thanks very much, Heli. That is a really sobering final thought. And thank you for your really clear explanation of the stark reality that prostitution just can never be made safe, which I think a lot of people don't seem aware of. I would now, I'm now delighted, in fact, to introduce our next speaker, Ash Regan. Ash is an independent member of the Scottish Parliament for Edinburgh Eastern. Last year, she introduced the Prostitution, Offences and Support Scotland Bill into the Scottish Parliament. It's known as the Unbuyable Bill, and if passed, this would bring the Nordic model to Scotland. So we really look forward to hearing from her and thank her for joining us. Over to you, Ash.
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone who's joined us this afternoon to talk about this issue, which I think is a very important issue, although it is an issue that I feel does not get the attention that it deserves, certainly in the public sphere and within politics as well. I've been working on this myself for around about 12 years. There's been a number of attempts to change the law on prostitution through the Scottish Parliament, the most recent of which was by a Labour member called Rhoda Grant. And this is well before I was elected, and I volunteered with her team to help her at the time she was trying to get this legislation through the Parliament about sort of 12 years ago now. When I first got elected, I immediately set about researching to bring in a members' bill on prostitution, and that was around about 2018. I was then promoted into government, and I was very pleased to discover that I'd been promoted into the portfolio that covered prostitution. So I thought, well, this is great. You know, I can now pursue this work from government, which in my opinion is, I think, where this work should be done from. I don't think this should be a members' bill. I think this should be taken forward by the government. However, despite working hard on this area for 4 years, you know, in the same way that I did on other pieces of legislation, I was not able to get this legislation into law. I left government and again immediately began working to start on a members' bill to do it, and now we're actually there. So I started work on this bill about halfway through this session, so about 2.5 years ago, thereabouts. And I was surprised, I think, to find when I got to what's called in the Scottish Parliament the non-government bills unit, and that's what gives you the resource and facilities to help individual members take a bill through the Parliament, that they told me they didn't have any capacity and they wouldn't be able to help me. So I've got no support on this bill. The Parliament itself is not even supporting me to do this bill. So this bill is being done by myself and my small team of very dedicated staff who are amazing, and that they're a testament to the fact that we've got it to this point in time. The point that we're at now is the bill. So the Scottish Parliament legislation goes through 3 stages, and we are just coming up to the end of the stage 1. So the committee has taken all the evidence that they want to take on the topic, and they're in the process of finalising what's called the Stage 1 report. We are anticipating that that will be published next week. It's very important for, in terms of political capital standpoint, that the report is positive about the bill. And usually what will happen is the committee will recommend that the Parliament support the bill, that they don't support the bill, or they remain neutral and perhaps have some issues. Obviously, I'm hoping that the report will come out saying that, you know, they recommend Parliament support this bill. And hopefully that will help me, because at the moment, not a single political party in the Scottish Parliament has given me their official support for this piece of legislation. So I am having conversations with people. I most recently had a conversation with the deputy leader of the Labour Party, who told me that they had yet to come to a decision. So anyone that's listening that is supportive of this legislation, I think it's still worthwhile contacting your politicians, talking about this on social media, writing letters to newspapers, etc., all the normal campaign activities to try to help support me in doing this. But sometimes I get asked, you know, why am I so interested in this? Why did I decide that I wanted to pursue this? And I think the only reason I can think of is I just think this is the most egregious example of the patriarchy at work, you know, creating this entire system to promote and protect and provide this infrastructure for male sexual entitlements, and then criminalize the women that are then exploited in that system. It just seems to me that this should be relegated to the past. You know, this is not something that we should be promoting or tolerating in a civilized society. And in my opinion, a modern Scotland would be following the Nordic model, and they would have implemented this type of legislation many years ago. But anyway, we are where we are. So Heli's given a very good overview on, you know, why countries might want to do the Nordic model and, you know, what prostitution is like for those involved. I was going to talk about some of that myself, but I'll keep it quite brief. My piece of legislation is very much based on the Nordic model. It's got the same key parts that that type of legislation would have. So it criminalises the buyer. The buyers, as we know, are almost, we think, about 100% male. So this creates a new offence that means that if you are attempting to buy sex, you will be committing a criminal offence. It decriminalises the sellers. We estimate that the sellers in prostitution are about 94–95% female. So you can see this is a very gendered system. And it also seeks to remove any convictions that women have received during, you know, if they've been exploited in prostitution and they've received convictions around that, then this legislation would remove those convictions. And it also, and for the first time, would put into statute the right to support. So there would be a right for those that had been exploited in prostitution to then be able to access support. And that would be, I think, probably the framework around that would be that they would be advocacy and so on into the normal mainstream services that everybody's entitled to. And then there would also be specialist support, including support to exit if that's what the women wished. It's not that different actually from what we have in place at the moment. We do, because people often say to me, oh, well, what's the law on this at the moment? There's a fair bit of ignorance, I think, around what the current law does and doesn't do. And we do already have legislation that targets sex buyers, and most people will know that as the curb crawling law. But I think that was brought in more as a way to combat what was seen as a public nuisance, rather than to make any, I guess, judgment on the buyers or the sellers. So the curb crawling legislation can criminalise the buyer or the seller if they are caught by the police. So there are some laws already. This piece of legislation just seeks to take that one step further. And I think it's entirely appropriate to do that. I often think as well, there's so much propaganda around the sex trade, which I think has obviously increased dramatically as the internet has kind of escalated. So I think it's important sometimes to remind ourselves who is in prostitution. And we know that a majority of the women that are exploited in prostitution entered as children. Many of them were victims of grooming or coercion. And I think the public is possibly starting to understand this a little bit better. It's not that long ago when, as we know from the grooming gang scandal that has been engulfing the UK, that say even 10 or 20 years ago, the police and other authorities were looking at 14-year-old girls and calling them, they'd made a lifestyle choice, or that they were child prostitutes. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. This is sexual exploitation, plain and simple. And these girls were groomed, coerced, and exploited. And that's what's led, I think, in the Casey review, which was commissioned by the Prime Minister to look into this issue. And in that, they were very clear that no one who'd been exploited that way should then be criminalised for their own abuse. So that very much ties in with what I'm trying to do in this legislation. A large minority of the women in prostitution have been sexually abused as children, or they may have come from violent or unstable family backgrounds. And we think in the Scottish context, and I imagine this is going to be quite similar across the rest of the UK as well, that because of the way prostitution has changed in the last few years, so it used to be that most prostitution was obviously on street, and much of it would have been not trafficking victims. Now that is very much turned around. There is still on-street prostitution in Scotland, but the majority of prostitution now is off-street. So it will be in things like pop-up brothels where women are trafficked, they're coerced, and they're often moved around the country, not just limited to Scotland, but they may be moved between Scotland, Ireland, England, other parts of Europe, and they're constantly moved around. So we estimate now, although the data is somewhat difficult to come by, that about 80% of those involved in prostitution currently in Scotland are probably trafficked. So that just gives I think it gives a lie to this idea that we're constantly bombarded with, that, this is a choice, women want to go into prostitution, they choose to go into prostitution. But when you look at these, this data, you can see that most of the women that enter prostitution either had absolutely no choice because they were trafficked and they're coerced, or they're groomed, or they had quite limited set of choices in front of them, which meant that prostitution wasn't really a choice at all. We know that prostitution obviously is this gendered system of violence. I think Heli's explained very well about that and about the effects that has on women. And what stuck with me, I think, when reading through some of this stuff, because I'm also being bombarded by people that are claiming, the line, sex work is work, it's just a job like any other job. But, it's not accepted by the International Labour Organization as being decent work. It doesn't fit any of those categories. And of course, how could it? Because what kind of job would leave you infected, sterile, with PTSD and incontinent by the age of 26? The other thing is we never hear from the buyers. So usually what happens in countries where this legislation is attempted, you have one set of women who are arguing that we should change the law and we should follow the Nordic model. And then usually we have another group of women who then appear arguing that actually, this is their choice. They feel they're able to manage the risks, and that they are worried about their safety potentially, or their business model should the legislation be changed. Who we don't normally hear from is the buyers. And I think when you read the way that buyers speak about women in prostitution, it's very clear why we don't hear from the buyers at all. There are review sites that people can go and look at if they're interested in this. One of the main ones is called Punternet. And this is where sex buyers will go and talk to each other. I think they are quite frank in these reviews because they're wanting to share, information as they see it. And it's very clear when you read these type of reviews, and I think Venessa will probably speak to this in a bit more detail in a minute, how these men view women and how dehumanizing the language towards these women is, and how much they view these women purely as a commodity. And we know that these are ordinary men. It's most likely that you'll know a man that's paid for sex. And we think somewhere between maybe 1 in 10 men in the UK is paid for sex. It may be more now. The latest study that I had is about 10 or 15 years out of date now, so it may well be higher. They typically earn a bit more than the average, and they're typically in relationships or married. And there's also a very strong correlation between men who buy sex and then other types of violence, including sexual violence, towards women. And that's because of what Heli was saying about how it changes their attitudes towards women. It's very dehumanizing. And so I think that you end up very entitled and often violent men who then go on to commit other crimes. And that was certainly reflected back to me when I had a conversation with Scotland's Lord Advocate, who's obviously head of the prosecution service in Scotland and has had a long career prosecuting as well. And she confirmed that to me. She said, yes, these are men that we will also see committing other crimes against women. And so I think that shows that there is a strong interest, I would say, from certain areas of Scotland, that it is in the public interest to criminalise the purchasers of sex, because it's a root cause offence, if you like. And so that's why I think we should look at it. I was going to go on to talk about what the Nordic model does, but I think Heli has already covered that. I think one of the things that Heli possibly didn't cover is that this brings Scotland into line with its international obligations. So Scotland, via the UK, is obviously a signatory or an adopter of various pieces of international legislation. So that's things like the Palermo Protocol and CEDAW. And at the moment, the system we have around prostitution in Scotland is not compliant with those obligations. So we've commissioned and we're about to publish a report that's been done by a human rights law expert, which really puts the detail onto that. So we can let you know where to go and find that, if you like, afterwards. And the other thing that we've done for the government is, because I was getting quite a lot of pushback on the cost, this was going to cost too much. And, we don't have the money, we can't afford to do this. My contention would be that it actually costs you more as a society to do nothing on prostitution, and that the costs of prostitution to society are very, very high. So some figures that we have is that it can cost around 250,000 per woman who is involved in prostitution, in order that will be, as you can imagine, her interaction with the health service, with social services and so on. And also another statistic that we have is that it costs Scotland about £380 million a year, but that's just in terms of the violence. So that's just in terms of the violence alone. So some of the projects that have been carried out, particularly there was one in Scotland, there's also obviously the one in Ipswich, where they invested heavily in an approach similar to the Nordic model, said that for every £1 you invested in this, you get £6 back. So we turned this basically into a report, which again, we can let people have if they're interested, because it's quite good for, if we're going to talk to legislators, this is helpful. The Scottish Parliament is supposed to be driven by the Christie Commission principles. And the idea of that is about preventative spending. That as a government, as a parliament, we should always be looking to things that are preventative. And in my opinion, this type of legislation sits very squarely in that space, that if we do this, it will have vast effects beyond the obvious ones, like shrinking the market of prostitution and reducing trafficking, which are very important in themselves. It also changes culture. It sends a message out to society that we don't accept the behaviour of these men, and also that we value and want to protect the women in our society. And in my opinion, that's a very important endeavour. But what I will say is that we're starting to run out of time in the Scottish Parliament because, and I'm just concluding now in case you're worried that I'm taking too long, the Parliament, what's called, goes into dissolution around about the end of March, early April, and that's because we've got an election coming up at the beginning of May. So what the Parliament's obviously got a lot of legislation to get through, not just mine. So they've cancelled February recess to give us some extra sitting days. But unfortunately, I knew this was always going to be a risk, but I'm starting to see it playing out in front of my eyes now, which is where everybody apart from me is starting to try to build delay into this process, I think in the hope that the bill will run out of time. And I'm very much pushing to make sure that doesn't happen. So the minister delayed giving evidence, so that delayed the process by a week. The committee has now delayed the process by 2 weeks because they were unable to agree the report, despite the fact that they could have sat for longer. They could have sat at different times in the evenings, on Fridays, etc. There's precedent for all of this. If they'd wanted to finish the report quicker, they could have done so. I then got communication last week saying that the minister, so this is back to the government, want to introduce another week or two's delay in terms of when the stage 1 debate and vote will be. So I've appealed to the presiding officer of the Parliament, and I'm going in to make representations on Tuesday to try to keep the stage 1 debate into January. So I can obviously let everyone know how that goes afterwards. But just to say that I think there's everything to play for, and I'm hoping that we are going to be able to shame or encourage, however you look at it, the other political parties into supporting that. But I'm certainly not in a position, unfortunately, to be able to come here and tell you that I have the parliamentary support yet. But we're doing everything that we possibly can to try to keep going and get the support that we need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ash. It must be incredibly frustrating to face those kind of delays, and we wish you the best of luck with making representations on Tuesday. We also really look forward to reading the report you've commissioned on the interaction of prostitution with Scotland's human rights obligations, which I always think is a fascinating area that doesn't get enough attention when people are talking about international human rights and nations' obligations.
Yeah.
So we look forward to that. Thank you, and we'll link as and when we can. We now have a bit of time to ask you a few of the important questions which often come up during discussion of this issue, and hopefully lay to bed a few of the myths that can be quite damaging during this discussion as well. The first question is, would the introduction of the Nordic model drive prostitution underground?
No. The thing with prostitution is that for the most part, I mean, it is visible in some places. So obviously, if you live in certain cities in Scotland, and I'm sure this is the same in England, you may still see some on-street prostitution. That it is possible that you see that. But if you live in certain parts of town, and I think Edinburgh is fairly unusual in that it still has what they call, euphemistically called saunas, but obviously are brothels. Most Scottish cities don't have that. If you are away from those kind of things, the likelihood is you're not going to know about the prostitution that's going on. Although the part of Edinburgh that I represent has a lot of what we would call tenements, buildings with various flats, apartments in them. And I have had quite a number of calls from constituents saying that there is prostitution going on in some of their apartments in their block. So, it is happening. But for the most part, most people are not too aware of it. But no, because the buyers have to be able to connect with the sellers. So this is the way the Swedish police explained it to me when I went to visit Sweden, that if it's marketing, the pimps are not going to make money unless they're able to get as many buyers as possible. And so they have to be able to advertise them. And so once they advertise them, then the police can obviously find out where they are. So that's the way the police have explained to me. It's not rocket science. And anyone that's had a look at the adult services, as they call it, websites, will see all the adverts. You can go on now and look, and you'll see hundreds and hundreds of adverts of women and girls for sale and prostitution in your own city right now, if you go and look. So the police are able then to use that or other methods of surveillance in order to find out where prostitution is happening, and then also to target it. But the other thing to do is to look at the countries that haven't adopted the Nordic model. And you can look at countries like Germany or the Netherlands or New Zealand. They've taken the opposite model. And what we can see in those countries is that trafficking increases and that the market of prostitution explodes. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Organized crime is rife and the violence escalates. So it's simply not the case to say that, the Nordic model would, drive prostitution underground or anything like that.
Thank you. That's a really comprehensive answer. And I think that question is one of those sort of motto or sort of dogmas that we hear people say, will the Nordic model drive prostitution underground? That leads us to the second question I have for you, which is, would the Nordic model make prostitution more dangerous?
No. And we have the data to back that up. So if you take this to the extreme, and I think trigger warnings apply here, that what Heli's explained to us about how dangerous and violent prostitution is as a system, then the Nordic model actually shrinks the market. So it makes the number of women that are involved in prostitution much less. So less women are going to be drawn into the system, trafficked in and harmed, and also murdered in prostitution. So if we look at the murder rates or the homicide statistics from the countries by the different models on prostitution, you can see very clearly that the models where they have either what's called decriminalisation or sometimes it's called the regulatory model, that those countries where the prostitution market just explodes and gets bigger, there's more violence and there's more murder, and the murder rates are higher. Whereas if you look at other countries then the murder rates are lower. And you can track that across all the countries and all the different models. It's quite difficult to do because obviously different countries have adopted the law at different times. Countries obviously vary in size and are implementing the law with various rates of vigor, I would say. So some countries are implementing it very well, very effectively. Other countries have perhaps changed the law, but they're not, they're struggling a little bit with the implementation. But yes, you can clearly see that in terms of the homicide statistics.
Thank you. And in terms of practicalities now, do you foresee difficulties in enforcing the law? For example, would it be difficult in practice to actually make arrests of men soliciting women in prostitution?
Well, this is something that the committee in the Scottish Parliament has obviously had an interest in, I think probably quite rightly. We have, I think, taken the time to learn from other jurisdictions. So we looked at the law, how it was drafted in Northern Ireland. We looked at how the law was drafted in Ireland, because we wanted to see if there was any learning that we could bring into the Scottish context. And so what we've done is we've tried to make sure that we've drafted the law in such a way that the new offence is as clear and as enforceable as it possibly can be. I've obviously had the Lord Advocates looked at it for me, so that, and she said she's happy with the way that it's drafted, that she thinks that it is clear and it's based on normal Scots law principles, and it avoids some of the issues I think that we have seen in Northern Ireland and Ireland, because it's been drafted slightly differently. But I think it's also fair to say, and I think that the justice agencies would also say this, that because it is a type of sexual offending, that it suffers from some of the challenges in other types of sexual offending and domestic abuse type cases. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't change the law, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't enforce the law. And I also think, and we can see this from countries like Sweden that have had the law for a very long time, that the way that they enforce the law is iterative. So they start doing things in a certain way, and then after a few years, they can see what works, what doesn't work, and they can change things, and they can make it better, and they can increase the number of arrests and convictions if that's a priority for them. So what I'm saying is, I think we will be able to, if we change the law in Scotland, we will be able to get arrests. I don't think it's good practice anyway to be relying on the woman's testimony. We want to be able to, but I think that in some cases that will be unavoidable. So I think in some cases that will be the case. But I would like us as a country to get to a position where we're able to make arrests with minimal cost, I guess, because I think everybody understands that you've got sort of a hierarchy of violent offending, and that countries often want to prioritise what they see as being at higher level of that. So, let's say this was, it was murder, it was at the top. We've got obviously a lot of evidence is now being used for mobile phones, that digital evidence. But I don't think there's any reason to say that as an iterative process, we can't, start where we are right now and then continue to evolve that so that we are able to get the conviction rates that we want. And I also always say as well, what we're trying to do here is we're not trying to criminalise and put in prison huge swathes of men. That's not the goal that we're trying to achieve here. What we're trying to do as a society is similar in what we've done in other pieces of legislation, where we're trying to change the culture. We want to create a deterrent effect. And we hope that by changing the law, many men that would have bought sex will simply stop just because of that deterrent effect, because it's illegal and because they don't want to be caught. But in order to do that, you will need to make arrests and you will need to convict some men. And we imagine that most of the men that are convicted under this will receive a fine, but there is the option for them to go to prison if that's what the judicial process thinks is appropriate.
Thank you. My final question at this point is, how do the costs of introducing the Nordic model compare with the costs of alternative approaches, both in financial terms and in terms of the costs to the girls and women who are being exploited in prostitution?
Well, I think I touched on that already. I think for many women who've been exploited in prostitution, if we are going back to what we were saying about possible risks to their health that they might have accrued over their time in prostitution, psychological risks, they may have PTSD, that's what we're talking about, due to trauma. They may need, extensive specialist sort of counselling or therapy. So there's huge costs involved in that. there's dispute about the figures. I know that Nordic Model Now have, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong here, have a paper where you put the costs per woman at about 300 to 350,000. And we have another one where we saw it was 250,000. But if we take that as, those being in the roundabout in the ballpark, we can see how expensive it is as a society to allow these women to be exploited in prostitution. And then the costs potentially of helping that woman falling on the state. But there's also obviously the cost to the women themselves. So that's something I think is probably better coming from somebody that's been through the system of prostitution rather than myself. But I can imagine this takes a terrible toll on women. And also there's the cost to society of violence as well. So we do have numbers on that. So personally, I think I would like to get to a position where we don't have any prostitution at all, because I think that women and girls are worth more than that. And I would like to get to a situation where we don't have that. But being realistic, I think we need to get this into law now and make the investment into the support services. Scotland, I have to say, is a bit embarrassing in terms of what we are providing in support services at the moment. The Scottish Government doesn't fund a single exit service. They'd like to talk about it, but they're not actually funding any, which I think is shocking. And it's very inconsistent across Scotland. So we have some good practice, we have some good services working. One that's very good is one that's called Roots Out. It's based in Glasgow, but it's funded by the City Council. So what I'm suggesting and what we've costed, so this is all fully costed. So if you want to go and look at the bill, so you'll find that this is the bill here. If you want to go and look at it, there's a lot of paperwork associated with the bill, which you can find on the Scottish Parliament website, or I think on my website, but one of my team members will confirm to me if that's there or not. And that's contained in the financial memorandum. So we are suggesting in there that we think that an appropriate start in terms of support would cost around about £1 million, which, some people think, oh, that sounds like a lot of money. But actually, compared to the overall Scottish budget, it is absolutely a drop in the ocean. And to be quite honest, in my opinion, and the opinion of lots of other people who work in this area in frontline services and in violence against women, we should be providing this anyway. It's not acceptable that women who are going through the system that we've just talked about, who could end up with the health, the psychological, PTSD, etc., from that system, are not getting the support that they deserve to get and should be able to get. So, and that figure of £1 million seems to correlate quite well, I think, with other sort of similar countries like Ireland, who are sort of a bit ahead of us in the process that are doing that. So it seems like that's quite realistic. And I think if we spend that money upfront here, we're going to see savings right across the whole of society and our public services. So I think it's an investment we should definitely be making.
Thank you very much, Ash. We will link to all the resources you've mentioned and your website and so on, so that people can go away and read all of the documents in their own time and forward them to their own MPs and others that we would love to put support behind you. We are now going to hear from our final speaker. We are very fortunate to have Venessa with us today. Venessa is a survivor of Edinburgh's notorious brothels, which are known as saunas, as Ash has mentioned. And Venessa is a passionate supporter of Ash's bill. So thank you very much, Venessa.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for being here and taking time out of your Sunday afternoon to listen in. Before we start, I'm just going to reiterate the trigger warnings here. A lot of what I tell you today will be difficult to listen to, so please ensure that you are in a mentally strong enough place to engage with themes of sexual exploitation, rape, assault, trafficking, etc. I will absolutely not be offended if you have to step away for a breather. Please just take care of yourself first and foremost. So my name is Venessa, as mentioned, and as a survivor of the sex industry in Scotland, I'm here to tell you a bit about my story. As a wee disclaimer, I might cry at points throughout this. Please do not worry. If I do, I am okay. We do have a support system in place here at Nordic Model Now for before, during, and after events like this. As I'm sure you can appreciate, reliving this is incredibly difficult. But I think it's important to let you know about the horrors of this industry and the lasting impact that it has on the individuals who survive it. I think we have to speak about the reality of this to stop it from happening to other women and girls in future, because this misplaced shame and silence is exactly what keeps this industry running. So I'm going to dive in now and tell you a bit about my story. I left home pretty much the day that I turned 16. I ended up homeless in Edinburgh, and just a few months in, I met one of the people that would later introduce me to prostitution. Let's make up a name and call her Betty. Betty had let me sleep on her sofa a few times. She'd been really friendly with me and helpful, and because I was underage, she'd bought me cigarettes every so often. By 17, my life was starting to come together. I'd been offered a council house and I was working in a shop. Unfortunately, though, because of my age, I was only earning £3 something an hour, and running my own household on that was impossible. So I was left with a choice at the end of every month, which was either to eat or pay my rent. I chose to eat. And as you can imagine, in just a few months, I'd racked up a fair amount of housing debt. The council then sent me a letter and presented me with the option to either pay towards my debt or be evicted. So I was faced with the prospect of being homeless for a second time if I didn't figure something out. I asked Betty for advice because she was 28, she ran her own household, and to a 17-year-old kid, she seemed like a great person to ask for advice. The advice she gave me was that one of her workplaces was hiring and she could get me an interview with the manager. She said it paid well, that it was cash in hand, and I could potentially pay off all of my housing debt in just a few months. Of course, that sounded fantastic, much better than sleeping on the streets again. So I agreed to the interview, which was done under the pretense of massaging the manager to see if I was any good at it. I went along to the sauna, which was a place in Stockbridge in Edinburgh. When I entered, I spoke to the receptionist and I entered this kind of dark, dingy lounge area where girls were sort of just sitting around in skimpy dresses. I felt like I'd just walked into this girls' club. They were all much older than me, but they were really friendly and they presented themselves as this sort of dysfunctional, supportive family that looked out for each other. And to a young girl that had no support system, that feeling of belonging was obviously quite alluring. The manager came and collected me, and we went down a set of stairs into a basement level of the building. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, there was this long white corridor that was lined with closed doors and brass door handles. And it was really strange, the specificity of some of the details that you remember from these situations. There was music playing faintly in the background, which dulled as he led me into one of the rooms and locked the door behind us. I remember feeling immediately nervous and anxious in that room. I felt vulnerable being locked in a space with a man that I didn't know. The room itself was dimly lit. It had these yellow bed sheets on the bed without a duvet on it. It was just like an undersheet and a pillow. It also had a towel folded on the end of the bed in this weird kind of fan shape, the sort of thing that you would see in a fancy hotel room. I thought that having a bed in there was strange straight off the bat. You know, it wasn't a traditional massage table. Anyway, I placed my bag down beside the bed and he took a seat on the edge of the bed and asked me a few questions. I can't remember most of the questions that he asked me, but I still looked like a child and I was baby-faced. So it was at this point that he definitely asked me my age. I told him the truth, that I was 17, and he told me that from that point on, I was to lie to anyone that asked my age and tell them that I was 18. As a side note, it was probably the most commonly asked question that I had. Um, and the men never believed me when I told them that I was 18. They outright said that to me. They outright said, I do not believe you. But still, it didn't stop them, even though that they knew I was under 18 and I was lying. They still paid to use me. Anyway, for reference, the manager himself was not a day under 60. He had white hair, wrinkles, and he was definitely old enough to be my grandfather. Initially, he lay on the bed face down, and with his instruction, I started giving him a back massage. Maybe a few minutes into it, he rolled over and instructed me to put his penis in my mouth because he needed to see if I was any good at it. I told him that I had a boyfriend, and he told me that my boyfriend would never know, and he promised me £40. I think that was the point that I realized that this wasn't a massaging job, and the severity of the situation I was in started to sink in. I did as he asked and left the room with £40 for a blowjob. And I suppose one of the very reasonable questions you might have is why, when it became clear that this was not a massage job, did you not just run out and tell someone? I did kind of weigh escape as an option, but there are a few reasons that I didn't run out. I fully believed, locked in that room with a man that I didn't know, that he had the potential to become violent if I refused him. And also my life experience to that point, probably somewhat tragically, had taught me that saying no only made the rape more violent. So it was better just to do what a man wanted so that I could make it out of the situation with the least amount of violence possible. There is a term for this now called fawning. I think we're all familiar with fight and flight, but there is also freeze and there is fawn. Fawning is when you appease your abuser in order to survive a traumatic situation. The other reason that I didn't run out was that logistically it was quite difficult. There was the locked door to the private room to get through, and then there was a set of stairs to run up, and then there was about 6 girls in the lounge to get through, and then there were 2 locked doors at the front of the premises. Afterwards, when I made it back out onto the street, I was walking down the street and I can still vividly remember how I felt. Every part of me remembers that feeling, but there isn't there isn't quite words to describe what it is. I don't think a singular word exists. Um, it is this horrific concoction of feeling violated and dirty and abused and disgusting and deceived and stupid and responsible and ashamed. In my mind, the people that I passed on the street were staring at me like they knew what I'd just done. And to try and explain away what had happened, the way that I justified this to myself, the way that my brain helped me cope with this situation, I told myself that I had just cheated on my boyfriend. There was just so much blame, and I carried that feeling around for years. I felt like I was a bad person, as if I'd had some sort of choice in the situation and I was responsible for what had happened. My brain might have protected me in that way, but my body could not lie to me. That evening, for the first time, I had a panic attack so severe that I was physically sick. Um, I never visited the sauna that I was interviewed at again, and unbeknownst to me, Betty had passed my number on to the manager, and I later got a text. I can't remember how long it was exactly. It was maybe a few days afterwards. It can't have been much longer than that. The manager told me that I had a job at a sister sauna, another premises that he managed, and it was nicer, and he wanted me to come and work a shift there. I remember kind of making these excuses, but he was just not taking no for an answer. He told me that Betty had given him my address and he would be by in the morning to pick me up. I just had to come and try a shift and see if I liked it. And, he was saying things like, the girls are really nice and they're looking forward to meeting you. And I didn't have to do anything that I didn't want to. I felt very backed into a corner and there wasn't really any option. He made it clear that he was going to turn up on my front doorstep anyway. And my fear was that he would tell my boyfriend what had happened at that interview. This became a really common way that they controlled me. There were subtle threats constantly made to tell the people in my life what I had done. And because Betty was already enmeshed into my life outside the sauna, this was really easy for them to do. It became a way of keeping me compliant and turning up to another shift. The manager also used this threat to regularly access my body for his pleasure without paying me. The exploitation of that actually got to the stage where he was trying to convince me to move into his spare room, because according to him, I wouldn't have to worry about being homeless again in that circumstance, and I could just keep everything that I earned and I could spend it on whatever I wanted, and I wouldn't have to pay towards my rent debt, all of these kind of things. The process of prostitution was not glamorous like it is portrayed on TV by the likes of Billie Piper. It is this strange combination of monstrous and monotonous. You are expected to sit around this lounge in a tiny, tight dress all day, waiting for a man to walk through the door and pay you for the pleasure of touching his penis. At the sauna I was in, there was a bell on the front door which announced a man's arrival, and we were literally conditioned like dogs. The bell went, and you were to stop everything you were doing. You were to rush to that lounge. You were to sit and flirt and present yourself as this cool, cute, fun, sexy girl who was just absolutely gagging for it. Every time that bell went, I was just overcome with this feeling of dread. And no amount of makeup can hide the utter disgust towards a man that repulsed you. I'd often think, please don't pick me. And at times I was borderline hostile to these men to try and repel the ones that were particularly horrible or the ones that I'd heard horror stories about. But I quickly learned that that was just a guaranteed way that they would end up choosing you. The only feeling that I can kind of correlate it to is, imagine being forced into having sex with the man on public transport that glares at you until you get off a stop early, or the one that makes you feel so uncomfortable that you share your location with a friend. Because the men in brothels, the ones that pay to use women's bodies, they abide by the same kind of principles. They enjoy making women uncomfortable. They enjoy knowing that you have no choice, that you cannot refuse them or tell them to stop. They get off on thinking that their cash is a ticket to your autonomy, and they relish in the power of that. Make no mistake, a prostitute is not the one in control. When I was involved in this, I had to lie to myself and believe that I was in control just to make it through the day, because the alternative is just too terrifying. But the truth is, if a man has purchased your body and you tell him to stop, if you tell him that he is hurting you, he will not stop. A brothel does not create a safe environment for sex work because there is no such thing. One of the most violent incidences happened to me in a brothel. I was pinned down against the bed by a man who choked and hurt me. I begged him to stop and he didn't. When he left the room, I came out shaken, crying, bruised, and I told the manager what had just happened. She shrugged and told me that it was part of the job. In a sauna, there were panic buttons installed in the rooms. There were buzzer entry systems to the premises. There was a sign-in system where punters used fake names. There were cameras outside and other girls who promised to help if something went wrong. But none of these security measures stopped that incident or other incidents like it from happening. No amount of safety measures will change the fact that you are locked in a room with someone who has purchased your body. That transaction has removed your autonomy. So the men feel entitled to enact whatever they please without any regard for the person that they have purchased. And as the law stands, they can do that without any consequences. The law needs to change. It needs to protect women. It needs to hold these men accountable for their actions. In my opinion, the people that are on the flip side of this, the ones who want to decriminalize sex work, fall into two different categories. The first group have financial incentive to decriminalize the industry. Usually they are pimps, they're those presently involved in vanilla forms of prostitution, or those who financially profit from it, or they are men who buy women's bodies. The second group, however, are naive, and they either haven't applied critical thinking or they haven't been exposed to reality of this industry. They have bought this lie that has been sold to them by a very powerful, very loud, and very rich category of people who profit from prostitution. I do understand that believing their lies is more comfortable rather than accepting the reality that thousands of women in Scotland are presently being bought, sold, and used by every 1 in 10 of our fathers, our husbands, and our uncles. By feeding you lies in popular culture and circulating myths like this is the oldest industry in the world, the powerful beneficiaries of prostitution normalize the abuse, and it makes us feel like we're running up against a system that is so deeply ingrained in who we are as a species that it would be pointless even trying to fight or change it. As a wee disclaimer, I would like to add that I have absolutely nothing to gain by supporting this bill. Whether it passes or not, the damage to me is done, and I'm going to be living with this trauma every single day for the rest of my life. What this bill can do, though, the reason that I am telling you about the worst and most horrific things that men have done to me, the reason that I am reliving this for you, is to try and end this cycle and prevent another little girl from going through this in future. If someone had done that for me, and we had ended this system of legally endorsed violence against women and girls, I would have had the opportunity to be an entirely different person than I am today. I deserved to be protected by the law, and I wasn't. I deserved to be treated as more than a vessel for men's pleasure, and so did my sister survivors. So do our daughters, so do our granddaughters and their granddaughters. I gotta wrap this up here, but if there's one thing that I want you to take away from today, it's this. The purchase of women's bodies for the pleasure of men is not free. It comes at a very, very high personal cost. For some of us, that price can be as expensive as our lives. For others, the price is our minds. But for all of us, the cost is our sense of safety in the world. Those of us who make it out alive, we're never the same again. I lost parts of myself in those rooms, in those beds, to those men. They stole those parts of me when I was really still a child, and I will never get those parts of myself back. I think it is long overdue that our society collectively agreed that the personal price of prostitution for women is too high. We deserve to be legally protected and offered so much more in this world than just being reduced to the price tag on our mouth, our anus, and our vaginas. That's everything from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Venessa. We are so grateful to you for your courage and for sharing your experience to fight this fight, even though we can see that it comes at a real cost to you. So thank you very much again. We now have about 30 minutes for a Q&A session with Heli, Ash and Venessa. We've had some questions submitted already. Please keep your questions coming in the chat and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible in the time we've got. The first question I have is one for Venessa. If you're happy to answer it now, that's brilliant. And if not, then we can move on, give you a bit of time. And we've got plenty more questions to get through for all of our speakers. So the question that's been asked is, the Scottish Minister for Victims and Community Safety said to the Scottish Criminal Justice Committee that this bill would make women involved in prostitution less safe because, for example, if buying sex was made a criminal offence, women would no longer be able to check clients' IDs, i.e. their passports or their credit cards, to know who they're dealing with. But what do you say about this ID versus anonymity issue as someone who has actually been in a room with these men in this situation?
This is not something that presently happens. I had never ever seen an ID in the time that I was in a sauna. And that is something I think has been reinforced by other survivors' experiences as well. None of us were able to do checks on these men. I think this is a lie that is sold by those who have something to gain from prostitution. If this was an idealized solution to keeping women involved in prostitution safe, then there are 2 points I would like to make. The first one is that seeing someone's ID is not going to stop them from violently assaulting you. Imagine being barricaded in a room with a violent man. What is seeing his ID going to do to stop him from hurting you? Realistically, nothing. And I'd actually argue that it has the potential to escalate things. In order to prevent you from reporting him, he could kill you. In theory, could it help you identify a man after he's assaulted you? Yeah, perhaps, but it's not realistic that women would actually report it because, as the law stands, regardless of the circumstances, prostitutes are still the ones that are acting illegally by selling sex. So realistically, who is going to turn up at a police station and incriminate themselves by reporting these abusive men? Also, our justice system, I suppose, is so broken that it is nigh on impossible to obtain a rape conviction when it happens to anybody. Can you imagine what the reporting process would look like for a prostitute? It just would not even get within sniffing distance of a courtroom because of the nature of her work. It would make it impossible for any lawyer to argue that it was rape beyond a reasonable doubt. I think the other point as well is that the men who use prostitutes do so because their anonymity is protected. A really real fear among punters is that they could be blackmailed, they could be extorted by the women they purchase. As we learned earlier on, a majority of them are married. They have children, they are financially in a superior position to the woman that they are buying. And also part of the allure and the fantasy for them is the anonymity. So I just don't think there is any realistic situation in which they would willingly hand over their details, because that could potentially put them in a vulnerable position. And their greatest fear is it's being held accountable and facing consequences for their actions. So yeah, sorry, that was a ramble, but I think in short, it's not a practice that presently happens, and I don't think it's one in which it could ever realistically work either.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think as with so many things in this issue, when people actually ask questions, then don't grapple with the reality of the situation, they can come up with all sorts of ideas about what might or might not happen. But as you say, what really happens is what we have to deal with.
Yeah.
We've had a question from a number of people, actually, so I'm going to ask this one because I think people want to understand, why is the Nordic model so controversial? And where does the main political resistance and inertia come from to having the debate and actually implementing the bill? Perhaps, Ash, you're best placed to talk to that, though you have a bit already. If you could talk a bit more about where you face this opposition and where you see it coming from.
So the first thing I'd say is that there's a lot of vested interest here, and there's a lot of money. So the profit involved in prostitution, and if we extend that out to porn as well, the profits being made annually from women's bodies, you wouldn't even believe the money that's involved in that. So that's the first motive. There's a lot of people making a lot of money out of women and girls exploitation. But politically, where I would say that this is coming from, because I've done opinion polling on this, and the public are behind me 100%. Most of the public can understand exactly what we've been talking about here today, that they know that it's exploitative, that they know that these men aren't nice people, and that they know that most women only enter prostitution when they've got very limited options available to them. And they understand that, and they would like the Scottish Government and the Parliament to take this issue seriously and to protect women from this type of violence. But the only conclusion that I can draw, having been working on this for about 12 years in Scotland, is that the vested interests must be in the government. They must be in the Parliament. They must be in the civil service. Because otherwise, I'm sorry if you can hear my dog, she's sitting next to me and she's making little noises. And that was what I couldn't understand, because I always tell this story that, as a minister, and the Scottish Government were quite lucky that many ministers are in their portfolios for quite a significant period of time, years, which is not as normal at Westminster, which means that you do have time to work on areas and see them come to fruition. You inherit some things, which I did, and then in my case, I took on two new things that I brought to the table myself, and then I went on to do something with. One of them was fireworks, and that became law. I think it was a couple of years ago now, and the other one was prostitution. And I started them both at the same time, pursued them with the same vigor, if anything, possibly more vigor for the prostitution, and yet I wasn't able to get it over the line. And it felt like pushing treacle uphill in the meetings with the officials. So whilst I've never really got to the bottom of it, that's the only thing I can think of. The other issue with the Scottish Government right now is that they have been very successfully infiltrated by lobbyists from certain ideologies. And obviously this fits into that. And we actually saw a list this last week. Actually, one of my staff showed me this, of who the minister that you're referencing had met with to talk about this issue over the last few months. And she's only met with those that are campaigning for the decriminalisation side. So that's the side that's opposite me. She's only met with people that are talking to her and telling her that the Nordic model is bad. And unfortunately, she's not taking the time, or she's being badly advised and taking the time to meet with organisations like Nordic Model Now, or frontline organisations that would tell her what's going on, or survivors or campaigners. So that's an issue as well, is that the government is often not aware that it's only listening to one side of the argument. And unfortunately, I mean, we're not just seeing this in prostitution, we're seeing this across a range of other policy areas as well. So it's a failure in government at the moment.
Thank you. So another question we have is, there seem to be a lot of young women, particularly on the left, who support a full decriminalisation model. What do Venessa and Ash, what do you think of that position? How do we reach those women or people who hold those views, particularly that demographic?
I think part of the problem is they are consuming this media that has been pushed out there that is telling them basically what the decriminalisation lot want them to hear, which is that it's romantic and empowering and, you know, it's all Billy Piper walking down the streets in London, walking away with thousands of pounds every week. What they're not hearing is the harsh realities of it. So yeah, I think they need to turn up to events like this. Maybe would be good for them to hear both sides of the story, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a confusion as well in terms of, because I think we've moved, I think feminism has moved more in this direction, that it's very much about the individual. And if you think something's empowering, then therefore, and you're a woman, that therefore it must be empowering. But I think we have to look beyond individual choice, and we have to look as a society to the collective and to the system. And if we can see, and all the evidence that we have on this suggests, you know, that prostitution is a violent, exploitative system where women are a dehumanized commodity, and we can see the effect that that has on women and on our society and on the behavior of men, then we can see that that's more important to design a legislative framework that minimizes that rather than to give that priority to individual choice. But I also think it comes back to ideology again, and that there are certain, I guess, I probably describe it like this, it's like an off-the-shelf set of beliefs now. And because of social media and the way that it, I guess it provides more and more reinforcement to you. If you express an interest in a certain thing, you'll get shown more of that thing and more of that thing. And so people are in these very narrow bubbles now of what they consume. And so there are certain views that are in certain ideologies. And so the one that I'm obviously bumping up against the most at the moment is the one about the conflict in terms of human rights between trans-identified individuals and that the impact that some of that has on women's rights. And part of that also is about prostitution. So again, it's about, you know, on that side, they would say, oh, but prostitution, you know, is empowering and it's a choice. And, you know, as you shouldn't interfere in other women's choice about what they want to do with their bodies. But I suppose our argument to that would be, well, the Nordic model doesn't do that. It doesn't place any judgment on what women want to do with their bodies. It is purely about holding men to account for their behaviour.
Another question we've had is about where the Nordic model has been successful. We obviously know that in Germany and New Zealand, full decriminalisation has led to significant problems, but a number of people have asked, what does success look like? So I would have asked you could talk a bit more about your experience in Sweden.
Yeah, so I have been to visit Norway and Sweden to look at this. Sweden, I went to, I think it was 2019 I went over there. And I definitely got the impression the Swedish were really proud of the legislation that they brought in, you know, being the first to do it. And they'd done it really from like an equalities perspective. And they are continuing to iterate that law. So they have changed what the sentencing might be for this. They've made it into much more severe sentencing for it. And then they're also looking at online. And so they're continually evolving this legislation to protect women and to move with the times in terms of how prostitution, pornography, etc., is all morphing and changing all the time and continuing that exploitation. But I think it's important for the law to keep up with that. So I think they are a success story that we can look at and hopefully emulate. But I also think other countries, you know, obviously we heard quite a bit through this process from Ruth Breslin, who works for SERP in Ireland. She came over to an event that I held in the Parliament just this week, talking about, you know, the effects it's had in Ireland. Now, whilst she would be the first to admit that Ireland has had some challenges in terms of how they've implemented their legislation, but they also feel that it's also having, you know, it's having a good effect. So she would say, you know, that the market of prostitution is stable, the level of violence is stable, but it is having a normative and a declarative effect, and they're going to work on how they implement it to make that to make it become even more successful. So I think that's the thing with this law. It's not always just about you know, how many people you can arrest or whatever. Yes, you need to have that, but it also has this effect in society where you can say, as a society, look, we just don't think this is acceptable. We're not going to turn a blind eye to this anymore, and we're going to do better for women and girls.
Thank you. We've had some questions about women exiting as well. In particular, several people have asked if Venessa could talk to us about her experience of exiting sexual exploitation and how she did that, what was most helpful. So, Venessa.
Yeah, sure. So I ended up exiting by saving up little increments of money, and then I paid to do a course, which had a job at the end of it. That's how I ended up exiting. But to kind of follow on from what Ash has said there, in terms of help from the state, in terms of exit services, I have never received any help in terms of counselling or any advice, anything like that. So I think that that is such an important part of this bill, which is to help women and girls afterwards kind of rebuild the parts of our lives, because that's often such a part that just we don't even think about. So yeah, that hopefully that helps a bit.
Thank you. We've also had some questions about the practicalities of the bill, Ash. A particular question was, what happens when punters are charged? And particularly, do the women who've been exploited have to be involved in that prosecution? You touched on this earlier, but is that something that's still being developed?
Well, obviously, I've spent quite a bit of time talking to the various justice partners. So that would be people like Police Scotland, the Sentencing Council, also the Crown and Prosecution Service, including the Lord Advocate, etc. So I've had numerous meetings with these people or people from these organisations, because I want the law to be workable. I want it to be enforceable. I want it to be clear. I want it to be, you know, an addition to the statute book that's going to work and be an example of good legislation. So me and my team have worked really hard to get us to this point. But like every other conviction, you know, the police will need to gather appropriate evidence. And if it's going to be, so one way you could do it is that the man, sometimes when men are confronted by the police, they confess. So that's also the most obvious route to a conviction. In cases where the man doesn't confess, the police will then need to gather a number of different pieces of evidence if they don't have the testimony from the woman. My expectation or my hope would be that I would like us to get to a point where we don't need to use the women's testimony in order to secure a conviction. And if people think about this for a couple of minutes, they'll understand why this would be the case. You know, if you're a trafficking victim, let's say you come from Vietnam or Bulgaria or Romania, they're some of the top source countries for Scotland at the moment. You probably don't speak very good English. You maybe have somebody controlling or threatening you. The last thing that you want to do is go and take part in the Scottish justice system. There are also women who, a bit like Venessa's explained, they might have punters who are particularly problematic and have been extremely violent towards them. They might then be very willing to go to court to get a conviction, possibly sex buying, but in addition, you know, something that's happened to them, some sort of violent assault, etc. And I think that is definitely a possibility. But then they will perhaps continue in prostitution. So there's other women they would not want to then have to go to court because they don't want to have to do that and to obviously go through that whole process, which can be quite long and drawn out and you know, time consuming and all these other things. What we've seen in Ireland, though, and this comes back, I think, to the safety issue, is that I've heard this reported from other jurisdictions as well, that women working in prostitution in areas where they have Nordic model type legislation, is that the power balance shifts. So, like in the way that Venessa just explained, that when you're in that room alone with that man, the man knows that he's the one breaking the law. So it subtly changes the power dynamic between the two. And then Ruth was explaining to us about what's been happening in Ireland recently, is that what's happening now is that when women in prostitution, who obviously now are completely decriminalised, can have a better relationship with the police. And when they have, violent punters, they're able to go and they're able to get convictions now onto these men, where previously that sort of violence that was happening against women in prostitution was going unreported because the women in prostitution could be criminalised themselves, and also they felt that the system wouldn't listen to them and it wouldn't support them in trying to pursue convictions against these men. But now that's changed.
This question probably from someone across the border from you, Ash, but the question is, my personal hope is for the Unbuyable Bill to inspire the House of Commons to adopt something similar for the whole of the UK in the future. Do you know of any initiatives in this regard that are perhaps being championed by MPs?
Going back again to how long I've been doing this, I went down to Westminster, I think it was 2017, and I spoke at the APPG on, I think it would have been on CSE or violence against women or something of that nature. And I spoke, and Jess Phillips spoke, and Jess Phillips obviously wasn't the minister for this area at that time, and she was fully in support of criminalising the buyer. So I'd like to hope when we get to this stage that when ministers go into government, they don't forget everything that they used to believe in. And so I'd like to think that she or the rest of, the Labour administration would remember that this is violence against women and they would do something about it. That I've met a number of individual Labour MPs who are very supportive of this legislation. They want to see this happening in the rest of the UK as well. And, there is the APPG, or there's a couple of APPGs at Westminster at the moment that have a focus on this, are pushing this, are doing events all the time. I went down again in the summer to speak at a couple. I think it was just at the beginning of July before Westminster went into recess. So there is an interest in this. I also think it shouldn't have to take this, but I think this, the fact that the public are more aware of what happened with like the grooming gang scandals. Now they have I think a lot of the public knew before, but it's certainly much higher up in the sort of public psyche about this idea about men and the way that they groom girls, particularly girls from the care system and so on. I think a few years ago that probably wasn't as, the public weren't as aware of that happening as they are now. And I think the tolerance level that the public have for watching this type of, clear abuse, the fact the state is not protecting these girls who are, they've got no active parental figures in their lives. They're not being looked after properly. And the wards of the state, that they're not protecting them from this, being groomed straight into prostitution. Because the figures on that I saw for Scotland, something like 50 or 60% of women in prostitution in Scotland have been through the care system. So that's ones that are typically working on street at the moment. I mean, that's shocking. As a society, we should be hanging our heads in shame that we are letting girls go through the care system and like a funnel into prostitution. It's absolutely despicable that this is going on. So I do think Westminster watches what goes on in Scotland. I also think sometimes when things happen in Scotland, England is more willing to look at them because you've got a close neighbour who's done it, and then you can see whether it's working or not working, what's the public reaction to this, and can we do it here? Now, obviously, Northern Ireland have already done it, although, they have had, I would say I'd probably characterise it by saying there's been a lack of interest in implementing it robustly. But however, they did change the law. I've actually been invited to go over to Stormont, I think, next weekend to talk to them about something to do with violence against women. So I think they've probably got an interest in strengthening the way they implement that as well. So yes, I think it can't do any harm. And I think it would most certainly put pressure on England to look to do the same thing.
Thank you. It's good to end on a relatively positive note. And I think you're right that England looks to Scotland sometimes, and it sometimes gives us courage to stand together. So we can only hope that that'll be what happens going forwards. We have run out of time for questions. Thank you, everybody. We've had an enormous number of questions. We'll save them. We can potentially use them for future webinars and look to answer more of them and inform more of the content that we put out. Just a couple of final announcements. If you live in Scotland, you will probably now want to write to your MSP, if you haven't already, to ask them to support Ash's bill using our 2-minute tool. And the website is up on the slide now. It just takes 2 minutes to give your support. So please, everyone, do that if you haven't already. And finally, we are happy to announce our next event, which is titled Porn Tech, From Sex Robots to AI Girlfriends, what is the social impact, which I think if we've all seen the headlines today about AI-generated nudes and the harms of AI-generated pornography, is going to be very relevant and very interesting. We're organising that event in partnership with Professor Kathleen Richardson, who is promoting her new book, Sex Robots, The End of Love. This is an in-person event and it'll be held in central Sheffield. It promises to be a fascinating afternoon, so please do come along if you can, and tickets are available on Eventbrite. It just remains for me to thank you all for attending and thank our speakers so much for giving their time and their expertise and talking to us. We all wish Ash's Bill the greatest of success. Please follow us on social media and check out our website, which has a massive information on the Nordic model. And please come to our next event. We hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.